In fields of science, with the possible exception of consciousness studies, theories are advanced, tested and compared by making observations on systems or subjects. The same methods of observation are available when we study the properties of the consciousness of other people. However, there is a unique issue connected with our internal viewpoint into our own consciousness. We have an external viewpoint not only into the consciousness of everybody else, but also into everything else we care to study. We even have an external viewpoint into our own bodies and brains. We have an internal viewpoint only into our own consciousness, and this is significantly different from the external viewpoint we have into everything else, including the consciousness of others. When we consider our own consciousness, it has features that we experience. Some aspects of these experiences can be communicated to others via language, art, music, symbolism, etc., and some aspects cannot. The features we can communicate are also those that we can observe in others and are called phenomena. Those that we experience are called qualia. This distinction between phenomena and qualia is a significant one. We use the term phenomena to refer to anything that can be observed from an external viewpoint. The qualifier is added specifically to exclude features of qualia that cannot be communicated to others in the form of phenomena. The way I use the terms, no qualia can be directly communicated. They can only be communicated via the phenomena that are associated with them. When I see green, my experience of the colour green is a quali. I can communicate some aspects of this by describing the type of green or mixing paints to illustrate the green I see, but these actions that you observe are phenomena. They may be derived from my quali, but they are not the same thing. When we see a field of grazing sheep, the qualia of green grass, sky, sheep, movement, etc. can be communicated in language, painting, cinematography and so on. There are, however, components of the qualia of the field that cannot be communicated and so are not phenomena, at least not until we develop some improved means of communication. Phenomena are accessible to an external viewpoint. Qualia are not directly accessible and are only indirectly accessible via their associated phenomena such as linguistic expression, art, music, etc. The phenomena associated with a particular qualia are not constant. 200 years ago, many of the qualia that can now be expressed in cinefilm were not expressible and so are non-phenomenological. That change has not made qualia directly expressible, it has only changed their associated phenomena. Associated phenomena probably also vary from person to person, but this can never be proved. As we cannot assess qualia directly, so cannot confirm that two people have the same qualia when displaying the same phenomena. The difference between the internal viewpoint we have of our own consciousness and the way we observe the consciousness of others has led to a long and verbose debate into the nature of consciousness. A recurring observation is that from our internal viewpoint, our own consciousness seems very special to us, and very different from what we find when we examine the wet grey tissue within our cranium. It has variously been described as feeling something or being like something to be conscious. This apparently special property of consciousness is used to justify various beliefs about its origin and nature. But we should expect things to seem different from an internal versus an external viewpoint, so it is expected that our conscious experiences are different from the phenomena we observe in other people and systems. I argue that this difference between internal and external viewpoint is sufficient to explain the special quality of consciousness without recourse to any other explanations. If it could be argued that the special properties of consciousness are not different from phenomena in a way that can be explained by an internal versus external viewpoint, then we would need to credit other possible explanations of the special properties, such as those discussed in the previous video. Actually, I wouldn't know where to begin to predict or explain the relationship between the internal viewpoint and what it felt, seemed, or was like. What we can say, however, without much controversy, is that we do have an internal viewpoint on our own consciousness. It is different from the external viewpoint we have on other people's consciousness. We can expect internal viewpoint to make things appear differently, and there are special qualities to our consciousness that may accord with this. I therefore argue that although we can make no further headway with the relationship between our internal viewpoint and the expected properties of consciousness, it is a reasonable explanation to default to for those special qualities in the absence of arguments or evidence to the contrary, in which I am in fact invoking Occam's razor. An immediate question about viewpoint is, what is our consciousness the viewpoint of? Is it the viewpoint of our brain? Tempting though this is, it is clearly not true. The brain does much that we are not conscious of, so it must be the viewpoint of a subsystem within the brain rather than the brain itself. The nature of this subsystem is somewhat intriguing. In the normal undamaged brain, the system appears to be dominated by a high executive reasoning, mainly governed by the left hemisphere because of the frequency with which we think in language. This, however, is not necessary to consciousness. We can lose part of the system and still remain conscious. Perhaps more interesting is that we can lose part of the system and in response to that we become conscious of things that we were previously not conscious of. For example, people who become blind become increasingly aware of other sensory inputs. This is most developed in people who have been blind from infancy and shows that not only is consciousness the viewpoint of a higher executive system, but there is not necessarily one particular high executive system involved. Moreover, it is possible to bring within the realm of consciousness things that are normally subconscious, without there being any damage to the central nervous system. You'll be familiar with the idea of biofeedback, where metrics like blood pressure or pulse can be made apparent to a person and then with practice can be brought under voluntary control. The philosopher Thomas Nagel used the question, "What is it like to be something other than yourself?" to explore the properties of viewpoint. When I ask, "What is it like to be you?" I mean, what would it be like if I had your internal viewpoint? When I consider what it would be like to be you, I naturally assume that it would be the same as being me in your situation, but this is clearly not true. Personality types differ markedly, and their awareness and consciousness correspondingly differ. Nagel avoided this problem by selecting an animal that is a totally different conscious experience from ourselves, a bat. Consider what it is like to have very poor vision and a sophisticated radar sonar system of navigation as do bats. Its consciousness is therefore completely different from ours and is dominated by the sonar sense it has. If we assume that being a bat is like being ourselves in its situation, we can easily imagine what it's like to have very poor vision and live in a world where we make a lot of high-frequency squeaks and hear echoes of them, but that's clearly not what it's like to be a bat. A bat is probably not aware of squeaks and echoes, but is aware of three-dimensional space and the objects located within it as we are. And its awareness stops when it stops squeaking, as does ours when we close our eyes. With a conscious effort, we can choose to be conscious of specific sensory inputs, but in general, this is not the case. We are conscious of the significance or meaning of sensory input without being conscious of the input itself. An example of this is the extended sense of touch that we all have. When stirring a pot of lumpy stew or dumplings, we can feel lumps with the spoon. Unless we specifically concentrate on the sensation in our hand, the thing we are conscious of is the lump in the pot, not the sensation of the spoon being struck that is created in our hand. Similarly, an experienced angler who hooks a fish is conscious of the presence of the fish on the end of the line, without being conscious of the sensation the twitching rod has in their hands. This is a particularly obvious example because the sensation and the thing we are conscious of are in very different places. But the same applies to all senses. In the case of vision, we are conscious of our whole environment in 3 dimensions and in high resolution, rather than the image seen at any instant by one or both eyes. These two figures illustrate the difference. The figure on the right is the one that we would associate most closely with, but it is the one on the left that our eyes sees at any instant. They have high resolution only in a very narrow central area, the rest of it being substantially lower. However, we are not conscious of this because we have access to high-resolution imaging of any part of the scene we are interested in simply by looking directly at it. All this is done automatically, allowing us to be conscious of an entire environment rather than the specific mechanism by which we gather the information. I noticed another good example of this phenomenon when an experienced light aircraft pilot of my acquaintance took me flying. It was quite a windy day, and the wind had been deflected by a nearby mountain range into waves, with rising and falling sections. As we flew, chatting about the view and the environment, he made frequent adjustments to the setting of the throttle control. To me it appeared there were no particular reasons for these adjustments, so I asked him about it. He explained that he did it because we were passing from areas where the wind was going upwards, meaning we needed less power to stay at a particular height, to areas where it was going downwards, requiring more power. This was a very plausible explanation, but when I asked him how he knew which way the wind was going, he wasn't so sure. After some thought, he explained that there were a number of cues. The feel of the aeroplane changed slightly. He noticed a slight change in the engine note and slight changes in his instrument readings. Perhaps the interesting part of the story is that after this exclamation, for several minutes he found it much more difficult to control his height, until we moved again on to another subject and he started doing it naturally once more. The meteorological phenomenon of lee wind waves is common in that part of the country. We were flying out of a small airfield in Wales, which was his home airfield, and he was highly experienced in dealing with it. His handling of the aircraft had become automatic, so he wasn't conscious of the sensory inputs unless he was specifically asked to focus on them. There are numerous examples of this kind of phenomenon. We can be sitting reading a magazine completely unconscious of a hubbub of noise and chatter going on around us until somebody calls our name. So we can note features of our own consciousness, and we consider how they might arise from the properties of our brain, and from that make a reasonable stab at how different it would be to be something else, such as a bat or perhaps a computer, to which I'll turn in the next video.